Creating bread from the ground up isn't solely an activity for the Amish. For them, it represents a distinct way of living. While many of us might simply dump ingredients into a bread machine, press a start button, and consider the job finished, the Amish method is considerably slower, quieter, and frankly, much more connected to the soul. They depend on the straightforward strength of their own hands, a handful of basic tools, and ample patience to see the task through. It all starts with the fundamentals, collecting the necessary ingredients. Now, that might appear simple enough, but here's where things differ. Numerous Amish families don't just grab flour from the local supermarket, as we often do. No, they frequently mill their own grains or source flour directly from nearby farms. Just picture understanding the precise origin of every component in your bread, right down to the very stalk of wheat it came from. It's an entirely different degree of farm-to-table connection that makes a fellow contemplate the kind of genuine quality he's forfeiting when grabbing a plastic-encased loaf off the grocery store shelf. Excellent bread begins well before the initial measure of flour even enters the bowl. For the Amish, gathering ingredients is practically an art, a dedication to quality that almost feels philosophical. Obtaining ingredients from local sources isn't merely about taste, it's fundamentally about cultivating relationships. Amish farmers don't function like standard grocery outlets. A significant amount of trust is essential. Handshakes take precedence over contracts. Flour might arrive from a neighboring mill, eggs could come from the adjacent farm's chickens, and perhaps honey originates from a relative's apiary. It constitutes a supply network that would stir envy in any corporate manager. Yet it operates without the endless barrage of emails and spreadsheets. These links aren't purely transactional, they're deeply personal. When the flour originates from a friend just down the lane, you aren't simply baking bread, you're also paying respect to their diligent efforts. However, it isn't always smooth sailing. Occasionally, the harvest might not yield as much as anticipated. I've heard accounts from Amish families describing how they had to improvise when crops failed to cooperate, substituting one type of grain for another, or carefully rationing what they possessed to ensure it lasted. It mirrors how our own grandparents managed during difficult periods, transforming whatever was available into something nourishing. And somehow, those loaves born from necessity often turn out tasting the best, serving as a reminder that valuable things arise from tenacity. I recall my own attempt at baking using flour that had lingered too long in my cupboard. It turns out freshness genuinely counts. What emerged from my oven that day resembled a brick more than bread. A lesson was definitely learned. The Amish are also strong proponents of organic farming, practicing it long before it gained widespread popularity. They avoid synthetic chemicals and shortcuts, relying instead on time-honored methods like crop rotation and composting. This approach to farming requires more time and greater exertion, but it maintains the soil's health for future generations. And when you bake bread using grains cultivated this way, the difference in flavor is undeniable. It's akin to comparing a tomato grown in your own backyard with those pale, watery versions found in supermarkets. There's simply no comparison. And naturally, there are the sweeteners. Not every Amish bread is plain. Some families incorporate a touch of honey or molasses for special events, lending the bread a deep, comforting flavor. It's remarkable how merely a spoonful of honey can elevate a simple loaf into something fiercely contested at the dinner table. I once attempted to covertly take an extra slice at an Amish friend's home, believing no one would spot me. Let's just say I discovered that Amish grandmothers possess uncanny awareness. They seem to have eyes located at the back of their heads. But truthfully, when the bread is that exceptional, getting caught is almost worth it. Once all the ingredients have been assembled, the actual labor commences. There are no electric mixers or sophisticated gadgets involved, just a bowl, a spoon, and hands intimately familiar with dough. There's a peculiar sense of satisfaction in pouring flour, yeast, salt, and water into a bowl and combining everything. Initially, it seems straightforward, but as the dough begins to consolidate, it starts feeling like grappling with an energetic toddler, sticky, unyielding, and just weighty enough to make you reconsider your commitment. The Amish, however, don't appear to resent this stage. In fact, they embrace it. A certain rhythm develops when mixing by hand, almost like moving to a cadence only the dough perceives. Scoop, stir, fold, repeat. It's the type of quiet exertion that fosters concentration, encourages slowing down, and allows you for a brief period to forget the world rushing past outside. Mixing by hand also imparts patience. The dough doesn't instantly unify. There are invariably dry spots that seem to elude capture at the bowl's bottom. You might be tempted to think, surely, just a bit more water is needed, but adding too much results in a sticky predicament. You'll spend the subsequent 20 minutes trying to remove from your hands. The key, something it took me some time to grasp, is allowing the dough itself to communicate its needs. If it's too dry, add merely a splash of water. If too sticky, incorporate a dusting of flour. It's almost meditative, like engaging in a silent dialogue with the ingredients. And each time you heed its cues, the dough reciprocates by coming together more effectively. The Amish would likely find my initial attempts at dough mixing amusing. On one occasion, I became so exasperated that I transferred everything into a stand mixer, thinking, what could it hurt? The instant I activated the machine, flour erupted from the bowl like a miniature volcanic eruption. I found myself standing there, coated in flour, realizing I had just violated the primary rule of traditional bread making: respect the process. I tidied up the mess and began anew, reverting to stirring by hand, feeling slightly more humbled, but also strangely resolute. There's an understated appeal in knowing you're executing a task precisely as people did centuries ago without resorting to shortcuts. The fact that it provides a decent arm workout is merely an added benefit. Who requires a gym membership when there's bread dough needing attention? It's also significant that mixing by hand transcends the mere outcome. It's about establishing a connection. You physically sense the texture evolving as you stir, you inhale the aroma of the yeast as it awakens, and you observe minor details, such as how the dough begins pulling away from the bowl's sides when it reaches the optimal consistency. It transforms from a mere chore into a tangible reminder of how gratifying simple tasks can be. The sole product we will ever endorse on our channel is a book authored by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, detailing 126 superfoods and preservation techniques from times of crisis, such as the Great Depression and wartime, which are otherwise impossible to find. We chose to promote his book because we represent the final generation capable of transmitting these methods and information about superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be regrettable to witness the disappearance of this knowledge regarding highly nutritious foods and preservation strategies essential for surviving crises. You can also locate a book concerning herbal remedies by Nicole Appelian in their store. If you are viewing this on television, you can search for our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet, and access the books by clicking the link provided in our channel description or any other video description. When was the last instance that simply stirring something imparted a sense of accomplishment? Mixing dough compels you to remain anchored in the present. If you hasten the process, the dough seems to perceive it, and you'll face the consequences later when it stubbornly refuses to rise correctly or develops the density of a brick. Kneading the dough is the point where the process truly intensifies. You've combined the ingredients, and now it's time to apply some genuine effort, quite literally. There's no sophisticated stand mixer to rely on here, just you, the dough, and the countertop. Initially, the dough feels tacky and resistant, as if it's evaluating your patience. But therein lies its appeal. Kneading involves more than just folding and pressing. It embodies persistence. You stretch, fold, turn, and repeat the cycle until the dough eventually yields, transforming under your hands. Somewhere between the initial push and the 100th, it yields, becoming smooth and elastic. If you've never kneaded before, allow me to caution you, it can feel like a proper workout. I distinctly recall thinking my forearms were contemplating lodging a formal grievance after my first loaf. Yet, the ensuing satisfaction makes every moment worthwhile. The Amish people have perfected this skill. Their hands move with a cadence born only from years of practice, akin to musicians diligently practicing scales. Observing an Amish baker knead dough is captivating. They possess an innate sense of precisely when to fold it and the exact amount of pressure to exert. And they accomplish all this without timers or recipes, depending instead on tactile feedback. You recognize the dough is ready when it gently springs back after a light poke, like a bread-based form of a high five. If uncertain, one technique involves stretching a small portion of the dough until it forms a thin, almost translucent membrane without tearing. That indicates you've achieved success. They refer to it as the window pane test, though honestly it feels more akin to magic. However, kneading is more than mere technique. It's therapeutic. There's something remarkably calming about the repetitive action, almost like meditation. Some individuals invest considerable sums in stress balls or yoga sessions, but all one truly needs is a lump of dough. Just 10 minutes into the process, whatever troubles were weighing on your mind begin to recede, leaving only you and the rhythm. I once encountered an article suggesting that bakers tend to live longer than the average person, and having spent time kneading, I can understand why. It's essentially free therapy culminating in bread. Who could desire more? And don't assume the Amish approach it with excessive solemnity. There's certainly space for enjoyment. One Amish gentleman quipped that kneading dough resembles wrestling a very courteous bear. It offers some resistance, but if you persist, it ultimately cooperates. And he wasn't mistaken. The dough genuinely seems to possess its own character, particularly on humid days when it stubbornly resists cooperation. Have you ever attempted kneading during the peak of summer heat? It's like grappling with a sodden sponge. But hey, at least you'll have something delicious to show for your efforts at the end of the struggle. If you're fortunate, you might catch a glimpse of an Amish family transforming kneading into a collaborative activity. It's not unusual for children to assist, their small hands pressing into the dough with the earnestness of experienced bakers. They might not always achieve perfection. The loaves sometimes emerge lumpy or uneven, but nobody seems to object. It's all integral to the process. And frankly, there's a unique quality to bread that visibly reflects its homemade origins, imperfections included. You know it was crafted with affection, and that enhances its taste beyond anything commercially available. Kneading might appear antiquated, especially in a world replete with bread machines and dough hooks, but there's a profound satisfaction in performing it manually. It connects you to the past, to the generations who employed this method long before electricity was even conceived. When you knead dough, you're engaging in a tradition stretching back centuries, if not millennia. It's quite humbling, really. I like to imagine that if bread kneading were an Olympic discipline, the Amish would secure the gold medal effortlessly. And honestly, they'd likely bake a loaf for the silver and bronze medalists simply because they could. This is the stage where the dough earns a much-needed respite, and so do you. After all that vigorous kneading, it requires some quiet time to expand and reveal its potential. For the Amish, this step involves more than mere waiting. It's about cultivating patience and trust. You've fulfilled your role, and now you allow natural processes to take precedence. The challenge lies in identifying the ideal location. Amish bakers frequently cover their dough with a cloth and place it in a snug, warm spot, shielded from drafts. Some might compare it to settling a baby down for a nap. You hope it rises without disturbance, but occasionally, circumstances become unpredictable. Temperature exerts a significant influence here, and lacking modern thermostats, the Amish depend on intuition. If the environment is too cool, the dough sulks, refusing to rise. If too warm, it surges ahead as if preparing for a race. I once positioned dough to rise on a windowsill, assuming a bit of sunlight would accelerate the process. Well, 3 hours later, I returned to discover it had not only doubled, but continued expanding. It appeared poised to escape the bowl, looking swollen and bubbly like a dough creature plotting a kitchen invasion. I had to punch it down merely to prevent it from spilling onto the counter. And let me assure you, there's a peculiar gratification in deflating an overinflated dough. It's like popping bubble wrap, but with a distinct purpose. Flavor development is another reason the Amish regard rising with such seriousness. As the yeast works its magic, it's not just creating air pockets, it's cultivating those nuanced flavors that elevate homemade bread far above anything found on supermarket shelves. Some bakers even permit their dough to rise overnight, enabling slight fermentation and yielding a deeper, almost tangy character. One could argue that bread possesses a personality. It requires time to mature, much like a quality cheese or a well-crafted joke. And speaking of time, this phase certainly imparts lessons in patience. There's no way to expedite it, no shortcuts available. Attempting to rush ahead will inevitably result in a disappointing, dense loaf that even the ducks at the local pond might disdainfully reject. The Amish, however, don't seem troubled by the waiting period. They find ways to utilize the time effectively. While the dough rises, there's usually an opportunity to churn butter, sweep the porch, or exchange stories over coffee. It's not merely about occupying time, it's about understanding that positive outcomes reward those who wait. And honestly, there's an element of magic in removing the cloth from the dough after a successful rise. It has transformed from a rough, lumpy mass into a smooth, airy entity, as if it had been practicing yoga in your absence. A properly risen dough practically implores to be shaped and baked, prepared to realize its destiny as bread. Of course, the process doesn't always unfold flawlessly. I've learned through difficult experience that dough possesses its own inclinations. Once I became sidetracked mid-rise and completely forgot about it for hours. Upon finally remembering, the dough had expanded so dramatically that it was cascading over the bowl's edges, seemingly intent on exploring the refrigerator. It was a sticky predicament, but I managed to rescue it. I prefer to think that every loaf incorporates a small element of chaos. It enhances the sweetness of the final product. Once the dough has risen perfectly, it's time to proceed to the subsequent phase, shaping the loaves. This is where the dough acquires its distinct identity, whether it culminates as a tidy loaf, a soft roll, or an intricately braided masterpiece for a special event. But first, a thorough stretch and fold impart the final bit of structure needed to maintain its form in the oven. Because if the rising stage was centered on patience, shaping the dough is where you can indulge in a bit of enjoyment. Now arrives the enjoyable segment, shaping the dough. After all that anticipation, the dough is finally prepared to fulfill its intended purpose, becoming a loaf of bread or perhaps a roll, or even an elegantly braided creation. There's a definite sense of accomplishment in gently transferring it from the bowl, still warm and pliable from rising, and carefully guiding it into its ultimate shape. This stage isn't solely functional, it's also an outlet for creativity. Some Amish bakers approach shaping as a genuine art. For everyday loaves, they might opt for straightforward rounds or oblong shapes, batards, but significant occasions warrant braided breads, often intricately woven with 3, 5, or even 6 strands. I attempted braiding a loaf myself once, and let's just say the result leaned more towards abstract modern art than a traditional masterpiece. But hey, even the most untidily formed loaf still tastes delicious. Within Amish communities, tradition holds significant value, and specific shapes often convey meaning. A braided loaf might appear at weddings or church functions, symbolizing unity and resilience. Other forms, like small, perfectly rounded rolls, are typical finds on a dinner table during Sunday supper, one for each person, and perhaps an additional one for the family dog patiently observing from beneath the table. There's a palpable sense of pride in crafting something aesthetically pleasing, even if its destiny is to be consumed within hours. If the dough happens to tear or stretch slightly imperfectly, that simply contributes to its unique character. Bread, much like individuals, doesn't need to be flawless to be cherished. However, don't be misled by the apparent simplicity. Shaping dough demands a degree of physical effort. Folding, tucking, and tightly sealing the edges necessitates steady hands and accumulated practice. It somewhat resembles trying to manage a toddler who refuses to remain still. One moment the dough is cooperative, and the next it adheres to everything in sight. You must handle it firmly, yet avoid excessive force. Pushing too hard causes the dough to flatten like a pancake. Being overly gentle results in sagging in the center. Some Amish bakers assert that shaping dough cultivates character. What constitutes good bread without undergoing a minor struggle? The texture is also crucial. The objective is to achieve a taut, smooth surface, generating tension so the loaf retains its form during baking. I once made the error of adopting a rather casual approach to shaping, essentially just plopping the dough into a pan and hoping for a favorable outcome. The consequence was a loaf resembling a deflated football. That experience taught me that shaping isn't merely about aesthetics, it's fundamentally about structure. The dough requires clear direction, much like instructing a child to sit upright during family portraits. Some Amish bakers even give the dough a few firm slaps on the counter, purportedly for good luck, though they'd likely never admit it's anything beyond a practical technique. Rolling dough into buns or twisting it into pretzels isn't just about nourishing the family, it embodies a rhythm passed down through generations. Children learn by observing their parents, surreptitiously taking small pieces of dough to manipulate, and perhaps even receiving gentle reprimands when they inadvertently puncture the perfect loaf their mother just formed. Yet, those moments remain ingrained, like flour clinging to your hands. Once the dough is shaped and has rested, the decisive moment arrives: baking. For the Amish, this phase involves more than simply adhering to instructions on a modern electric oven. It relies on skill, intuition, and a measure of experimentation. Many Amish households utilize wood-fired or brick ovens, which present their own unique set of challenges. Unlike contemporary ovens, these traditional counterparts lack digital thermostats that signal readiness. Instead, it becomes a guessing game. Is the oven sufficiently hot? The only reliable method to ascertain this is by testing the heat, sprinkling a bit of flour onto the oven floor. If it turns golden brown within seconds, it's time to bake. If it incinerates instantly, well, perhaps a brief coffee break is warranted while things cool slightly. Wood-fired ovens offer more than just a means of baking bread, they provide an entire experience. The fire must be initiated well in advance, sometimes hours prior to baking, allowing the oven ample time to attain the correct temperature. During midsummer, this translates to heating the kitchen until it resembles a sauna. But once the fire is established, it demands constant attention. You'll observe bakers adding logs, regulating airflow, and occasionally dispersing smoke as if conducting a fiery orchestra. I once attempted baking in a wood oven myself, envisioning a quaintly rustic endeavor. It concluded with me frantically fanning the smoke detector while my loaf transformed into something more akin to a brick than bread. I suppose certain tasks are best entrusted to those with expertise. Mastering temperature control in these ovens is a skill transmitted across generations. Some seasoned Amish bakers can determine the oven's readiness merely by sensing the internal air temperature. They'll insert their hand for a second or two, just long enough to gauge the heat without scorching their eyebrows. If queried about how they ascertain the perfect moment, they'll typically shrug and respond, "You just know." It represents the kind of wisdom acquired only through years of consistent practice, similar to knowing the precise duration for steeping tea or navigating television commercials without missing crucial plot points. What's truly captivating is that each oven possesses its own distinct personality. Some run hotter on one side, others cool down more rapidly than anticipated, and a few appear to exhibit moods, cooperative one day, obstinate the next. Yet, this inherent unpredictability forms part of the appeal. It's not about achieving perfection, it's about embracing the journey. The Amish believe that the bread mirrors the baker's emotional state. If you approach the task calmly and patiently, the bread tends to behave accordingly. However, if you're rushed or preoccupied, the loaf might emerge lopsided, serving as a gentle reminder to remain humble. Let me emphasize, baking in a wood-fired oven generates an aroma that's utterly irresistible. It permeates every nook of the house, clings to clothing, and lingers long after the bread has been extracted from the oven. I once attempted to sneak a slice before the loaf had adequately cooled, but the bread protested by disintegrating beneath my knife. Lesson reaffirmed, patience is non-negotiable when pursuing exceptional bread. With traditional baking methods, the entire process becomes an integral part of the ritual. There's no expediting, no shortcuts. The bread is ready when it reaches readiness, and that constitutes its inherent beauty. Once the loaves are securely situated inside the oven, the most challenging phase commences, determining the precise moment to remove them. If you've ever engaged in baking, you understand this internal struggle. It's not as straightforward as setting a timer and hoping for the best. The Amish approach, timing like a choreographed dance, a rhythm cultivated through experience rather than reliance on a kitchen clock. Certainly one could track minutes, but bread shows little interest in adhering to your predetermined schedule. It operates on its own internal clock, and achieving optimal results demands complete presence, observing, smelling, and listening attentively. The initial indicator is the aroma. As the bread bakes, its scent evolves from yeasty to nutty and warm, filling the atmosphere with that unmistakable fragrance, capable of weakening even the firmest resolve. I'm not embarrassed to confess that I've lingered near the oven, anticipating that exact moment when the smell transitions, convinced that perhaps, just perhaps, it's ready. Naturally, my impatience has led to more than one loaf sporting a pale crust and an undercooked center. Timing, it appears, remains a virtue I'm actively cultivating. The Amish depend on straightforward yet effective signals. The crust's color is a primary one. It should exhibit a deep golden brown hue, bordering on dark. If the bread appears pale, it requires more time. If excessively dark, well, perhaps you've inadvertently created extra crispy toast. A gentle tap on the loaf's underside serves as another traditional test. If it produces a hollow sound, it's finished. If not, back into the oven it goes. And yes, this often necessitates handling hot bread with bare hands, not an endeavor for the timid, but a competent baker understands that occasional kitchen bravery is essential. Opening the oven door prematurely constitutes another common novice error. The temptation is strong. Just a quick peek, you assure yourself. However, opening that door before the bread structure has fully set can prove disastrous. The abrupt temperature drop causes the dough to collapse more rapidly than a poorly constructed soufflé. It's analogous to watching a suspenseful film and fast-forwarding to the climax too early. The moment is irrevocably spoiled. A baker's patience, I've come to realize, is rewarded with perfection, or, at the very least, an uncollapsed loaf. Timing also fluctuates with the seasons, which contributes to both the charm and the difficulty of traditional baking. A bread requiring 30 minutes in winter might need 5 minutes less during the summer's heat. Some attribute this to kitchen temperature, while others maintain it's the ambient humidity. An Amish friend once informed me, with a knowing wink, that bread simply possesses its own temperament and dislikes being hurried. Rather like children, she added, you must provide space for growth, or they'll rebel. Experienced bakers cultivate an almost uncanny instinct for timing. They recognize when a loaf is done merely by observing how the crust subtly retracts from the pan's edges, or how the surface crackles upon cooling. No clock, no thermometer, just the kind of insight gained only after baking countless loaves. I once inquired of an older Amish baker whether she ever employed a timer. She simply smiled and replied, I place more trust in my nose than in a clock. I found myself unable to dispute her logic. Now arrives the most challenging segment, waiting. The bread might appear flawless, its aroma permeating the house like some form of edible enchantment, yet yielding to the temptation of slicing it too soon constitutes a rookie blunder. The Amish possess sufficient wisdom to avoid rushing this crucial step, understanding that bread requires time to stabilize. Extracting a hot loaf from the oven marks only the initial phase. Allowing it to cool correctly is where patience truly yields its benefits. Have you ever attempted to slice a loaf immediately upon removing it from the oven? If so, you're intimately familiar with the outcome. What should manifest as neat slices instead collapses into a jumble of steam and crumbs. This is the bread's way of communicating, not quite yet, friend. Traditionally, the bread is positioned on wire racks for cooling, permitting air to circulate freely around it, thereby ensuring the crust retains its crispness. Omitting this step allows the trapped internal moisture to escape, transforming that beautifully formed crust into a lamentably soggy state. It's akin to meticulously ironing a shirt, only to immediately toss it into the laundry hamper, rendering the effort pointless. Some assert that the Amish adhere to this stage so rigorously they might even allow a loaf to cool for an entire day prior to slicing. While I've never personally achieved that degree of self-control, they might indeed be onto something significant. Cooling serves purposes beyond merely preventing the bread from disintegrating. It also facilitates the full development of flavors. As the loaf gradually cools, all the constituent ingredients that diligently collaborated to become bread, flour, water, yeast, are afforded an opportunity to mellow and integrate. It resembles a musical symphony requiring the final note to gradually fade before the composition feels genuinely complete. Slicing prematurely leaves the bread's flavors underdeveloped, akin to consuming a song that concluded abruptly mid-phrase. I once believed I could circumvent the system by furtively cutting a slice while the bread remained hot. I armed myself with a knife, prepared to savor a fresh piece generously coated in butter, only to witness it crumble into a disheartening mound. The butter melted into a pool, the steam escaped indignantly, and the result was more of a bread catastrophe than a satisfying snack. Lesson duly noted, exceptional bread warrants the wait. And rest assured, the loaf won't vanish during the cooling period, unless, of course, children are present, in which case all assumptions are void. Some individuals perceive cooling purely through a scientific lens, yet it also embodies a form of ritual. There's a meditative quality to that intermediate period when the baking is finished, but the bread isn't quite ready for consumption. It evokes sensations similar to waiting for tea to steep or listening to rainfall, quiet, gratifying, and strangely fulfilling. Within Amish kitchens, this interval often serves as a time for sharing stories, completing chores, or embracing a moment of quiet contemplation. It's as though the bread itself demands not only patience, but also mindful presence. And speaking of presence, there's a technique I learned from an Amish baker. If you tap the bottom of a fully cooled loaf and it still emits a hollow sound, you've executed everything correctly. It's a minor, uncomplicated test, yet there's profound satisfaction in that knock-knock moment, as if the bread is offering a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Once thoroughly cooled, the bread is finally ready for slicing. However, here's another piece of advice acquired through experience. Never employ a dull knife. I once attempted to cut a fresh loaf using an old, blunt bread knife, and let's just say the bread offered considerable resistance. A sharp knife is indispensable if you desire those perfectly uniform slices rather than a lopsided disarray. And believe me, after patiently waiting for the bread to cool, you'll want those slices to appear as exceptional as they taste. Now that the bread has cooled and is prepared, the sole remaining action is to share it and savor it alongside your loved ones.